We would like to call our next witness, Professor Deborah Weissman.
So, I am just so grateful to be here. Thank you to the commissioners for all of your time and for the folks who have worked so hard to put this together. For the past 8 years, I've been working with law students at the Human Rights Policy Lab, some of whom are here and some of whom are trapped in mandatory review sessions because finals are about to start. And we have been working to document North Carolina's role regarding extraordinary rendition and torture and to obtain some measure of relief for victims. We've documented North Carolina's and ARRO's involvement through our collaboration with the Council of Europe, their review of flight data from the FAA and from the Council of Europe, analyses by experts at the Rendition Project, Freedom of Information Act and other litigation produced documentation, the 2014 Senate Select Committee on Intelligence reports, reports from the United Nations, from European legislative bodies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, journalists, plane spotters, and other research. These materials have been compiled in a 2012 study that was endorsed by 3 leading European experts, including 2 UN Special Rapporteurs and the President of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights at the Council of Europe. The report has been used by the Department of Defense and by an Italian prosecutor in Milan, and it has been updated and expanded by the International Human Rights Clinic at Duke Law, and recently, as you've heard, by the Rendition Project, whose staff has offered some new findings. At least, I guess it's now 49 CIA detainees were extraordinarily rendered to torture on planes operated by ARRO Contractors, an aviation company based in Smithfield, North Carolina. ARRO's planes were housed at the Johnson County Airport and the North Carolina Global Trans Park in Kingston, both public facilities. Together with law students in the Human Rights Policy Lab, we've compiled narratives on 36 victims, and we've submitted materials, 570 pages worth, that document our information. We've done so with the hope that with the revelation of circumstances and the egregious violations that victims have suffered, that we would assist in yielding transparency, repair, and restoration as required by law. This morning I'm going to present the facts and circumstances of just 3 of those victims. You've heard much of this already from Dr. Raphael. We've picked these 3 individuals, the first because he was swept up in the US bounty program, the second because he's been designated a high-value detainee, and the third because his rendition was likely just purely a mistake. And these 3 individuals and their various situations, I think, underscore how dangerous extrajudicial programs is, because whether we pick the best or the worst, what we are doing is working completely outside the law and contributing to some of the most egregious human rights violations we can imagine. So their stories differ, but they're nearly identical for what they tell us about unimaginable suffering. The details of extraordinary rendition and torture are really difficult to compile, very difficult to compile, and very difficult to describe, and you have heard some of it. And of course, there's much more to know about the victims than their experiences as torture victims, but I'm going to focus on the torture details. You've heard some of them before, but at the end of the day, all of the laws that seek to protect human beings from the suffering that they have endured come down to the suffering they have endured, and we have to hear these stories as painful as they are. I'm going to focus on the stories and link them to the North Carolina planes that facilitated these acts, facts our government does not wish us to review. The torture first starts with the protocols that Dr. Raphael described, used during the rendition process that involved North Carolina planes, a process that was very similar for all victims. Their captors, as you heard, sliced off their clothes, put them into diapers, and hooded them. They were restrained head to foot, immobilized. They were dragged or thrown onto aircraft. They were restrained and prohibited from moving, and if they did move, if they were to squirm because of pain, they were beaten. If they asked to be able to change positions, their mouths were taped shut. The plastic cuffs that were placed on their wrists were so tight that they left grooves in their wrist. As you heard, many had suppositories forcefully inserted into their anus, painful, shocking, and humiliating experience as sexual assault. And international human rights bodies consider these very acts of extraordinary rendition to be in and of themselves a form of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment in violation of the Convention Against Torture that we have not only ratified, but we have domesticated. So, Sharkawi Abdu Ali al-Hajj. He was extraordinarily rendered on an aero-operated plane, at least once, probably twice. He was seized in Pakistan in February 2002 by American and Pakistani forces at a time when the United States offered large bounties for the capture of suspected enemies. It's likely that his first rendition on an aero-operated plane, tail number N379P, occurred several days after his arrest. His captors forced him on the plane, restrained him about the neck while he was hooded and handcuffed, and delivered him to Jordan into the hands of the General Intelligence Department, or GID, known to routinely violate human rights. For the next 23 months, Mr. al-Hajj was subjected to continuous torture and interrogation. His captors hid him from representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross who visited the GID facility where he was held. And by the way, in answer to Dr. Sparrow's question, in the narratives that we did of 36 individuals, there are probably at least 6 individuals who were hidden from the Red Cross, and possibly many more because some were held in a camp, one of the dark sites in Guantanamo that was actually unknown to people. The Red Cross wouldn't have known to ask to see anybody there. He says in his own words, "I was being interrogated all the time, in the evening and in the day. I was shown thousands of photos, I mean really thousands, I'm not exaggerating. And in between, you have all this torture. The abuse, the cursing, the humiliation. They threatened me with being sexually abused and electrocuted. They beat me in a way that does not know any limits. They threatened me with electricity, with snakes and dogs. They say, we will make you see death. They threatened to rape me." After prolonged torture, Mr. al-Hajj confessed to false allegations and manufactured facts to make the torture stop. But he did refuse to sign a report with statements that he had never uttered. His captors then threatened him with further torture, saying that they would pluck his beard, something the Nazis did to the Jews. Mr. al-Hajj signed the statement, although it was not true. His second aero rendition occurred approximately 2 years later, in January 2004. He was taken out of his cell, hooded, and put into a car. His captors cut off his clothes, performed a body search on him, including a search of his rectal cavity, forced him into a diaper, handcuffed him, tied his hands and feet together, and threw him like a sack onto a Boeing 737 tail number N313P, operated by aero contractors. He was rendered to Kabul, Afghanistan, and transferred to a CIA dark prison nearby. And throughout his detainment at that facility, guards kept him in complete darkness and subjected him to continuous loud music. The cell was filthy, the food was extremely bad, and on occasions, he was force-fed when he refused to eat because he could not eat the garbage he was served. He was later transferred to Bagram in Afghanistan, a location known to host horrendous torture atrocities during the global war on terror, and an aeroplane delivered him to the torture he suffered in Afghanistan. In September 2004, he was transferred to Guantanamo, where he remains in Camp 6 with most of the other detainees who are also being held without charge. Mr. al-Hajj is described as frail and gaunt and in constant pain. As of August 2017, his weight was 104 pounds. He finds it too physically demanding to be removed from his cell, even to consult with counsel or to attend habeas or periodic review board meetings. His medical treatment, to say the least, is wanting. Abd al-Raham al-Nashiri. He was extraordinarily rendered on 3 occasions on airplanes. He's been identified by the Department of Defense as a high-value detainee after accusations of orchestrating the attack on the USS Cole in 2002 and a French civilian oil tanker in 2002 as well. I'm sorry, the US Cole was 2000. Allegations he denies. He was first captured in October 2002 in Dubai and taken to the dark site Cobalt, which is also known as the Salt Pit in Afghanistan. After 5 days at Cobalt, al-Nashiri was rendered on an Aero aircraft, tail number N379P, to the Green secret detention site located in the military base in Thailand. In December 2002, the CIA closed Green and moved al-Nashiri to detention site Blue in Poland. His torture in each of these places was merciless. In 2003, he was rendered on the same plane to Morocco, and although there are no specific documentation of his treatment there, it's reasonable to assume he was tortured, as were others who were rendered to Morocco. Al-Nashiri was moved again in 2004. However, his exact rendition circuit, when I last checked, had not been precisely established, and he has been in Guantanamo since 2006. Al-Nashiri's torture in the dark sites in Guantanamo, to where he was delivered on at least 3 occasions by aeroplanes, has been described in human rights reports, the Senate report, and by investigative journalists. The torture sessions he endured after the North Carolina plane left him in Thailand were videotaped, but the tapes were destroyed. However, court documents and the Senate report provide a summary. He was sodomized, he was sleep-deprived, kept naked, kenneled like a dog, crammed into a box the size of an office safe, subjected to walling, so-called detention grabs, facial slaps, waterboarded, hooded, stripped naked, shackled to the floor, exposed to cold temperatures, force-fed, isolated, and threatened with a revved power drill while hanging shackled and nude from a ceiling. At Blue, his physical torture was so severe as to raise alarm with CIA interrogators, including James Mitchell, one of the architects of the torture program. Mitchell, however, did not intervene. As he stated, quote, "I was expecting medical personnel on site to stop the interrogation, but it didn't happen." Yunus Rahmatullah, of Pakistani origin, was in Baghdad for reasons related to his rice importation business when, in February 2004, he was captured by what was known as Task Force 121, a US-UK Special Forces unit, and then detained in a US secret prison system for a decade, basically because of a case of mistaken identity. Throughout his 10 years of detention, he was never charged or tried, yet he was subjected to brutal torture. After being hooded and beaten, he was taken by helicopter to Camp Nama, a secret detention facility located at the Baghdad International Airport, sealed off from access from ordinary military personnel and the International Committee of the Red Cross, a particularly notorious place for abusive and unlawful interrogations. Rahmatullah was tied by a vehicle, by a rope. The vehicle quickly accelerated, and he was dragged along the ground for approximately 20 meters. Immediately following this ordeal, Rahmatullah was thrown into a pen containing a large number of dogs, which, although muzzled, attacked him with their claws. He was left in the pen with the dogs for around 5 to 6 hours and intermittently beaten. The techniques used on Rahmatullah included brutal beatings, stress positions, sensory overload, forced nudity, food deprivation, death threats, threats of sexual assault, being choked and led by a rope, and confined in a cupboard-like space for 5 to 6 days. Soldiers also suspended him upside down, dunked him in cold water, poured his own urine onto him, and forced him to lie in a pile of naked detainees. The latter experience is still too traumatic for him to discuss at length. He was moved again, possibly to a different site within the same prison, and his torture continued. In March 2004, Mr. Rahmatullah was again moved, this time extraordinarily rendered to Afghanistan. During his rendition, his entire body and face were covered tightly with duct tape, with just a small hole under his nose. He was taken onto an aircraft and then given an injection that caused him to lose consciousness. The aircraft that transported Rahmatullah to Afghanistan was most likely the N313P, operated by Aero contractors. In January 2005, he was moved to Bagram Air Base, where he would remain until 2014. The conditions Rahmatullah suffered during his years in Bagram were egregious. He was confined in a small cage-like cell, subjected to sensory deprivation, sensory overload, and extreme temperatures, deprived of food and medical care, placed in a long-term solitary confinement where there was either no toilet, causing him to urinate and defecate on the floor, or the toilet was his only source of water, and subjected him to sleep deprivation where he would be beaten if he fell asleep. He was sprayed with pepper spray and tear gas, and he was injected with a substance that caused paralysis for a period of 3 days and made his physical movements thereafter excruciating. They disrespected his religion, interfered with his ability to pray, and was told, "This is how we treat Muslims." In early May 2014, at least 4 years after the government realized that Rahmatullah was of no interest to them, he was taken to meet with the representatives of the International Red Cross. He was told he was being released, but he was forced to sign a document agreeing not to criticize the United States for the way he was treated. He was transferred to Islamabad and then to a jail in Quetta and finally released. Rahmatullah's case is exceptional in another way, in that he did seek and obtain some measure of justice from the courts in the UK. Reprieve, a nonprofit organization, brought suit on his behalf, arguing that the UK failed to take effective measures to protect his rights pursuant to an agreement that the UK had entered into with the United States and Australia. In December 2011, upon the issuance of a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of Rahmatullah, the UK government reported that a request had been made to the United States to secure his release. US authorities, however, refused to comply. The case continues. In January 2017, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Rahmatullah's case must go forward, despite the government's efforts to hide behind claims related to national security. Rahmatullah, as you can imagine, has had severe difficulty readjusting to his life after release, relives traumatic episodes, quasi-psychotic experiences, suffers emotional detachment, and cognitive problems. These cases also shed light on that of Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, the U.S. soldier who walked off his base in Afghanistan, who was recently sentenced after a court-martial here in North Carolina at Fort Bragg. Bergdahl's torture by the Taliban is eerily similar to the abuses these victims suffered at the hands of the CIA. Said one expert, Bergdahl had been in conditions that if it were a dog, you'd be thrown in jail for pet abuse. Like almost all of the victims, Bergdahl was placed in stress positions for months at a time, beaten and kicked, caged, and suffered severe sensory deprivation and solitary confinement. And thus, the treatment by the victims at the hands of the CIA, to whom Arrow delivered, it's now material for jihadist recruitment videos. And without some form of accountability and repair, we are collectively dehumanized. Thank you.
Let me ask a question, if I may, Professor Weissman. You've mentioned that both of these airports in North Carolina are public facilities, and I wonder if we could explore what that means. Does that mean that North Carolina taxpayers fund their operation in whole or in part, and that these airports that are used for the activities that we've described here are therefore taxpayer funded? And are they also regulated by or operated by public bodies that may be responsible to the public?
Yeah, I think you pretty well answered the question in posing it, which is helpful to me. So Johnson County Airport is a political subdivision of the state of North Carolina. And the North Carolina Global Trans Park is a state-created industrial transportation park. So both are political subdivisions, if you will, of the state. Arrow could not exist but for engaging in contracts and other sorts of transactions with Johnson County Airport. It relies on the public airport for permits and inspections, And so, of course, our tax dollars are very much implicated in facilitating these flights and the torture.
You've described a lot of these different types of torture, and I wonder how many of them can be considered a form of mock execution.
So there are a number of stories, and again, 570 pages worth at your disposal for 36 individuals who describe being threatened with death, their family members being threatened with death, or mock execution. Something akin to what they understood to be a gun held to their head, a drill revved and being held to their head, being placed in coffin-like boxes. So a good deal of the torture techniques threatened the end of life for these individuals.
And can I just follow up? What do we know of what medical treatment is actually being given, for example, to the first currently in Guantanamo?
For Mr. Al-Hajj, I know that his attorney this past fall had to file a motion for emergency medical treatment, and the court documents reveal by expert testimony, medical testimony, that his treatment is completely insufficient, almost to the point, I'd say, of being totally indifferent to his medical needs.
That phrase, indifferent to his medical needs, has legal significance under the Eighth Amendment?
Good point.
Question? Yeah, in your research and in your report, did you find any, or is there anything related to the complicity of just the American medical profession, both the medical doctors and also the psychiatrists and psychologists, related to supporting this program?
Well, we know, and we know a lot more thanks to the ACLU and their lawsuit, Salim versus Mitchell, that the architects, if you will, of the CIA torture program were two psychologists who were allowed to function without any sort of oversight. Perhaps more distressing than that, and I think you'll hear from Stephen Solz, who is the expert on this later in much greater detail with much greater knowledge than I have, but there's just been a failure to properly sanction psychologists who have engaged in this program, who designed the program. As far as the medical treatment, we know from Mitchell's own statement that there was insufficient medical intervention on behalf of al-Nashiri. So there's not a whole lot that I've read that details the medical treatment that some individuals obtained. I think maybe it was Zubaydah who was just so wounded when he was captured. You know, he was shot and bleeding and in devastating condition. He was saved by medical intervention, but I don't have the details of the degree to which medical personnel failed to provide adequate treatment. We know just from prisons, I think it's so useful that Professor Mendez referenced the situation of U.S. prisons in domestic circumstances. We know that medical treatment in prisons is rather horrendous, and there have been so many efforts to litigate these issues, sometimes successfully, sometimes not.
Thank you.
This is a question from an audience member asking that you talk a little bit about the process that led you to do this research and the ways in which your students are involved as well.
Sure. So back in 2007, there was a conference at the law school, and who should appear to speak at that conference but Christina Calger, who did just an amazing job awakening those of us who were in attendance to what was happening in our own backyard. And it was truly a shock to me to know that we were participating in this sort of egregious human rights violation. So I asked if we could help. And the answer was yes. And so our first task was to help with the documentation. But thereafter, the law students, and so it was law students who met with the investigator from the Council of Europe and poured over data and graphs and all sorts of records. Thereafter, we have tried, and you can go, if you're interested, to the UNC Law School webpage of my class, which is the Human Rights Policy Lab, and you'll see report after report done by students researching why international law applies in this case, why it applies not just to the federal government, but to the states and localities and aero contractors. There is this sort of strange academic debate, I'll say strange, about whether international law applies if treaties aren't domesticated, what courts can do with regard to these international treaties, and the students were just incredibly wonderful, and I'm just so fortunate to have worked with them because it's a little bit of trauma for them. I mean, I know that when they read through the Senate Select Report on intelligence, they had a hard time reconciling what they understood about their government and what they were reading. But lots of research about these debates about the applicability of international law at all levels, from contractors on up to the federal government. They have worked with Professor Mendez in examining some of the particular features, new standards that are being developed, draft standards on accountability in detention. They have worked very hard on behalf of one particular individual who you will hear from his wife, Abu El-Qasim Brutel, in filing a special procedures matter before the UN Committee on Torture, and have benefited from engaging with so many experts and so many wonderful human rights attorneys and advocates.
Thank you, Professor Weissman, for that really extraordinary, helpful testimony. We are now. We have one quick question.
Yeah, real quick. Thank you, Professor. Just briefly, because you touched on this, have you gotten any response from current or former government officials about the fact that this program has been a rallying cry for Muslims internationally and for terrorist recruiters specifically? I mean, what has been the response?
We have gotten no response. Time and time after again, members of North Carolina Stop Torture Now have met with local and state officials if they are even willing to meet with us. We've been pretty well stonewalled.
Thank you.
Thank you.